Paul, welcome and thanks for joining me. And I want to start off with here we are in March 2021. You guys just started your baseball season. And I know it's been about a year since the last season was canceled. And, so much of coaching is preparing our players to be their best and overcome adversity and kind of respond to certain situations. And I just want to hear from you over the last year since you had to cancel last baseball season and now just starting this season, what has impressed you most about your players over the past year?
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Evan. Certainly exciting to wake up this morning, get a chance to talk baseball with you. We've had some great conversations in the past, so was looking forward to today for sure. In terms of COVID, you're right. It's almost been a year, right? I think it was March 15th. It was St. Patty's Day last year. In fact, I'm in my office and I remember I had it was St. Patty's Day. Our season got canceled, bars closed down, and Tom Brady had just announced he's going to Tampa Bay. And so it was a confluence of just bad circumstances for a Boston guy, especially a Boston Irish guy that coaches baseball. So it was a tough day. So in terms of my guys, you're right. I think in all sports, we talk quite a bit about adversity, and particularly at our level, Division II level, this is and all levels of college sports and even professional sports. It's about using sports as a medium to teach life skills, right? And so I know we had plenty of Zoom meetings during the course of the pandemic with our team, and we continually reinforce this idea of, you guys have learned how to handle adversity on the baseball field. Now you're actually getting to apply it in life right now. Being at home, classes being canceled and put on Zoom, struggling with family members that may be struggling with mental health issues or just physical issues along with what was going on. And what I would say about my team is, they handled it in an A+ level. I just, their attitude, their mentality, their engagement in Zoom meetings for 9 months, trying to do baseball on Zoom is pretty difficult, to see their engagement in the process. And then, the byproduct of that is we've been practicing for 2 weeks. They came back. It was the first time we've been able to get together as a group. And our coaches, literally after the first week of practice, we said, wow, it feels like we just picked up from March 15th. Like literally, mentally, they were locked in and engaged. And so I've been impressed with their ability to manage their mindset during the last 9 to 12 months.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear. And I know that it can be really tough on Zoom. Talk a little bit about that. How do you teach baseball on Zoom and keep a group of 18 to 22-year-olds engaged in a virtual world when you don't have the on the field setting?
Yeah. Well, you have to be creative. We've been fortunate, actually. My literally last January, I hired Kirk Neuenhuis, who played here at APU, was the 100th overall pick in the draft in '08, played in the big leagues for the Mets for about 6 seasons, just retired a year ago. And so he came on in this past January full time on our staff. So coming from the big leagues, now he's coaching college baseball with his alma mater. And then we have COVID and we're on Zoom. So we took advantage of that time having Nui. I call him Nui. So Kirk, I should probably, because we're online right now. So Kirk did a tremendous job of we would do hitting Zooms, we would do positional Zooms. We brought in Stephen Vogt, who's another alum of ours who plays with the Arizona Diamondbacks now, who's very close. In fact, played with Kirk while he was here at APU. They were teammates. And so we brought Vogt on. So now I have 2 big leaguers on a Zoom, 50 guys get engaged pretty quick on the conversation of baseball. And so we did hitting, pitching, catching. We did some mechanics stuff. And then the other thing, a shout out to the ABCA, American Baseball Coaches Association. I've been a member since I've been, 24 years old and graduated from college and started coaching. the ABCA, a part of their membership is you get the videos from the clinics that go on every year. And so I have a database of clinics from the best coaches across the country, right? Coach Corbin at Vanderbilt and Savage at UCLA and all these guys. And so what we did is we handpicked, Kirk and myself went through a lot of these clinic videos and said, okay, what would apply to us at our level? Let's get on a Zoom. We'll give them a 30-minute, UCLA presentation on pitching, right? And then we'll take 30 minutes and we'll discuss what are the things that hit us personally. One is Cougars. How does that fit in with what we do philosophically, right? The stuff at UCLA is doing, does it fit with what APU's been doing? And then what can we take from this video and start to apply to this spring? So that's kind of what we did on the Zooms. It actually, I still have notes on my desk from those Zoom meetings that I poured through the other day before I went to practice. So it was good.
Yeah, that's cool for the players too, just to kind of get a different perspective and maybe just hear maybe a different spin on some of the same things they've been hearing from you and your coaching staff. And just always kind of nice to get other sources kind of in your brain, in addition to what you get from the coaching side as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I've learned through the years, I even at 50 now, and I feel like I've coached long enough to have a little bit of voice with my players. But I remember the first couple of years I was coaching, I had a player of mine, I'd been talking him through some concepts offensively, but about loading early, getting ready to hit earlier, right? Let's just say that's the example. And for weeks and weeks and weeks, I'm going through it. And about 3 weeks later, he comes back and comes into practice. He says, "Hey, coach, I was watching TV and Barry Bonds started talking about getting loaded early." And he had nothing in his mind connected the fact that we'd been talking about it 3 weeks earlier, And so I remember at that point being 26 years old and, understanding that I'm just a young guy anyways. Why would I even listen to myself at that point? I do think sometimes what happens is when you are able to show them that, hey, here's a concept that we're learning out here. It might not be clicking. My terminology might not be vibing with the athlete, but you hear it from someone else. And obviously the names of the coaches I just mentioned are Hall of Fame guys. And so they garner that respect right away. And there's no, we have enough humility around here not to worry about who gets the credit. We just want the kids to be their best. So yeah, I think it's great.
Yeah, a great lesson as a young coach. And by the way, you're a young 50 for sure. So
Thanks for that.
yeah,
Yeah.
of course, of course. And you mentioned being a young coach, and I know you have a unique coaching background. You coached baseball, but then you also were a football player as well as a baseball player in college, and you coached football for the first couple of years of your coaching career. And I'm
Yep.
just curious, having that football mentality as a coach, and then also being a baseball coach, is there any overlap or is there anything that you've taken from the football mentality early in your career that you've used in your baseball coaching?
Yeah, for sure. Early on, I think being a football coach, I coached 9 years collegiately in football, 3 at my alma mater and then 6 at Pomona-Pitzer down the road until I came here to Azusa Pacific. So 9 years there's a level of discipline and practice planning that goes on with football with 100 athletes. So a couple things I learned. One, you need to be detailed, where I think if I just started potentially, depending on, although my college coach was a very detailed person, but he was also a college football coach in his younger days. So we had very detailed practice plans on the baseball field, but being a college football coach, I learned that you had to be detailed. You needed to block things out. We needed to go from the scaffolding learning methodology where we go from an individual to a group setting to a team setting where you're building off each, learning process for the kids. I had to learn that on the football field right away. And so when I got my first head job as a baseball coach, where I was lacking a ton and still do probably in a lot of ways, experience and knowledge of the game, you can make up for a lot of that when you're younger with being detailed, right? Detailed with your bullpens, detailed with your practice plans. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing, Evan, I would say is in football, you have to rely on your assistant coaches. You can't micromanage a football team. There's just too many moving parts. And we see that as athletic fans, and you see what goes on in the NFL. Coordinators coordinate the offense. They run it. They're like a mini head coach, or coordinate the defense. And so I think over the years, I've hopefully learned that it's important if I have a pitching coach or I have a hitting coordinator or whatever, or a run game guy, I need to let them, for lack of a better term, run with that, right? And take ownership of it without micromanaging it. So those were probably the two important details I think I got from football.
Yeah, I can remember in one of our conversations, you talked about some of the patience and the calming influence of a
Hmm.
baseball coach, and it's almost the exact
Yeah,
opposite of football coaching.
yeah,
But you're 100% right on the preparation and the attention to detail, and then also just letting guys coach.
yeah. And you're right. I don't think I tell my guys all the time, I don't think I'm a good, my son says I'm a great dad. I'm not a great dad coach for baseball, right?
Okay.
And so, which he's 100% right. And I think there's a level of intensity that I have that would suit football much better than baseball. And so, I'm sure my players would probably say the same thing, you know. But at the end of the day, I also think I say that, and in the same breath, every year I'm trying to not be less intense, but be more purposeful in my intensity, I guess, where it was probably unbridled when I was younger. Now it's probably a little more purposeful. And I also think kids nowadays, you've been around generationally, kids change and you need to adapt as a coach. The same level of intensity you had 20 years ago just isn't going to, fly right now, or you're not going to help your kids become the best they can be unless you can adapt a little bit. So
Yeah.
yeah,
So
baseball calmed me down a little bit.
without question, you kind of have to
Yeah.
talk about that adaptation. You started as the head coach for Pomona-Pitzer in the mid '90s, and you had great success with that program. Took them to their first conference championship in, I think, since 1955.
Mhm.
And just talk a little bit about kind of the way that you led that team, and maybe the difference in the way that you lead your team today.
Yeah, that's funny. We talk about that quite a bit. I'm still in touch with those Pomona-Pitzer guys. During the pandemic, we would do weekly Zooms, and they included me in the process, which was kind of cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I love those guys. I always feel like it's a disservice to them. I tell them, I go, the older guys, I say, hey, if you ever came to our practice now, you would just want to slap the heck out of me. The how nice I am now compared to when I was 27, 28, and we were trying to develop a culture and a team mentality and a winning process. You would think to yourself, man, that's a different guy. So I think, when I was younger and we were you're right, it was something like 57 years um, since Pomona-Pitzer had won a conference championship. So that's a lot of years of um, negative self-talk, really, as a program, right? And
Yeah.
so I think, and being young and not having experience, and then just being a football coach, I treated my baseball team like a football team. We're going to be disciplined and we're going to play hard and we're going to be tough, and that requires a coach that expects that from himself, and will expect that from you guys. It was a lot of 5:30 a.m. workouts and training that baseball guys might say to themselves, how does this apply to me hitting a ball out of the park or throwing a strike? And we were more interested in developing mental toughness with that group of kids. And then, of course, byproduct with hopefully some good recruiting was a level of competitiveness that those kids learned how to bring out in themselves because of that process. So I think that that kind of spearheaded that level of success. And now, what's been wonderful about it, a lot of people don't follow smaller level sports, but Coach Frank Pericolosi, took over when I left to become at Azusa, and he's just crushed it over there with the Pomona-Pitzer kids. Like it was like you broke the 5-minute mile. Now everyone breaks the 5-minute mile. Once that 2001 team won the conference, now they just believe they could do it, and it just that kind of groupthink changed over there, and Frank's just done such a good job with that club. So that's been pretty cool. I've evolved though. Now I'm older. I'm like the grandparents. If when your parents get older and you have kids, you're like, hey, Dad, you weren't that guy when I was 7 years old. I think I'm more of that guy now. And as I get older, I'll be even more of that kind of grandfatherly, you know, hopefully a little more wisdom. The intensity comes out in smaller bouts and that type of thing. And you could still get the same results, I believe.
Right. And you talked about this team that had a little bit of an identity with that losing,
Mhm.
which is understandable. Did you think maybe that intensity was required? I mean, obviously you felt that in the moment, but when you look back and I'm just hearing you describe it, it sounds like they kind of needed a little bit of that. They needed a little bit of maybe kick in the butt and maybe a little bit of fire from their coach to kind of get them to start thinking that way. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a combination because yes, I agree with that 100%. But when you think about the whole development of it, recruiting is such a crucial part of that, right? And so if you look, you have to find the right kids that mesh with that level of intensity, right? And so it wasn't a 2 year turnaround. It took 5 years. It was after our senior recruit class, um, which was 5 years into it at Pomona, had a really good season, and they were a game away or two from winning the league, which was the best season the school had ever had in terms of win-loss and competing. It was the sixth year, which was all the recruits, all those kids have been through the fire, all those, right? And then recruiting kids, that talking to high school coaches, going out and watching them play, maybe worrying less about their results and more how they handled their results, right? How'd they handle striking out? What were they like in the dugout? I remember one player I went out and recruited. His name's Luke Smoody, was still close to this day. He was a captain for me. And I went out to watch him, and he struck out, played third base, and he was struck out a couple of times, but he was 6'3", third baseman. And I got more excited about him because I watched him during the game after having a tough day offensively. And I watched his leadership in the dugout, and he was vocal and he was tough. And then I think after striking out twice, he probably got hit by a pitch and didn't jump out of the way or something silly, that might feel silly. And he walked out of it knowing a college coach was there that day, feeling like he failed. And I got on the phone that night and said, man, I loved watching you play today. And then it was guys like that you built that mentality around, and then they carried it with the other players. So I think it was a combination of both. He already had that mentality, but then he found a program that helped support it. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, we could spend the next 2 hours talking about
Mm.
this without question. I think this is one of the things, especially young athletes don't really understand this, but you hit it on the head in terms of a coach evaluating that talent. You're not like, you already know he's a good player. Like,
Mhm.
you're there to watch them. And as an evaluator, I didn't learn this until later in my coaching career. As a young coach, I would just be looking at the game and the results. But you know, in football, when they walk off the field, are their teammates high-fiving them? Are they vocal?
Mhm.
Are they still engaged with the game? Even if you're watching a young athlete that's playing a different sport, like, are they fighting to the end of the game? Or if they're up 20 in the basketball game, are they calling for the coach to take them out because they don't want to get hurt? It's little things like that, like you said, that it doesn't seem like a big deal, but if you know what you're looking for and you know how to evaluate those intangibles, that tells you the entire story. And I think you
Mm.
just outlined it with that player.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I actually, I'll tell you a quick story. This young man never played for me, but Glendora High School, my son plays for Glendora High School, goes to Glendora High School and plays sports there. A couple years ago, we had a quarterback baseball player, Jacob Gonzalez, who was, a Team USA baseball kid. In town, everyone was like, hey, he's going to be a baseball guy, but he played quarterback on our football team. And being a football guy, and my son going to the high school, we go to the football games, and I'd sit way up in the top of the stands and just, watch these guys. And we have two players on our team from the high school that were two sport guys. I saw them play more football games than I saw these two guys play baseball games in their high school career. But we recruited them, and they're both great players for us. But this young man, Jacob Gonzalez, he was in a playoff game, and he's a stud of an athlete playing quarterback. Knew his career was going in baseball, but a competitor. In a playoff game, throws a pick six. Okay, which that's a big one. All the weight of the world's on his shoulders. 15,000 people at the game. It's Jacob Gunn, and I watched him run off the field. And I remember telling my son, I can't remember if he was sitting with me or when we were driving home that night, I said, hey, did you see how Jacob responded to that pick six? And he's like, no. I said, hey, he ran off the field. He went over to his coach. He didn't drop his head. He was going to get another series. Like I said, that guy, I said, I haven't seen him play a ton of baseball, but I said, if and when he does, he's going to be a really good one. And I said, it was because of that moment. I saw how he handled the tough moment. And in the game of baseball, you have more tough moments than you have great moments,
Yeah.
and the ability to be able to accept responsibility for it, and then believe in yourself enough that you could go out the next at bat or the next play and turn that double play is like a crucial, like you said, intangible. And so even watching those guys play football, I would try to pick up stuff like that, and it applies to us on the baseball field.
Yeah. And, it's so big in terms of building the culture and really like that team mindset. And I want to know from your perspective, you're obviously looking for that in the players that you recruit. If you're going to create that on your team, does that have to come from recruiting? Or is there an element that you and your coaching staff are trying to build that mental toughness and kind of that resiliency as well once they get to your program?
I think I do think I alluded to it earlier, Evan. I think it's a combination of both. I think when I was younger, I had this impression that our coaching process, I do believe this narrative. I believe every kid has it in them. I think we all have the potential to be taught a process to learn how to be, whatever the terminology is, mentally tough, strong-willed, mind over matter, all these things we talk about. There is a process to that, and many college coaches and professional coaches are bringing in sports psych, and it's all over the internet now, right? And helping control the controllable, change your paradigm, self-talk, groupthink, all these things that we go through. So I do believe there's a process to learn it. But I think it's a heck of a lot easier as a coach when you have that process in play, but then you bring in an athlete that already kind of has that mindset. Now you're honing it, right? It's like the same thing. When I bring in a guy 90 throwing strikes, I'm a heck of a lot better coach than I bring in a guy that's throwing 90 throwing balls, right? All of a sudden now I'm the best coach in the country. And I probably really didn't teach that young man anything. He was already doing it, right?
Right.
So I think there's always that tension for me. I'll never give in as a coach, and I tell the players this, to the fact that you can't learn this and be great at it. I just think some kids pick it up a lot quicker, obviously, right? And then your culture becomes a little stronger. Those players are usually your best kids, and then it feeds off itself.
Totally. And we've talked in the past about kind of the way that you were able to shift the culture at Azusa, and you've really had a really cool span in the last 20 years at Azusa, because you've had not only starting out at NAIA and really building that program up to being on the national scene, but then making the leap to Division II and kind of doing it all over again. And so I just want to take us back to early Azusa when you guys were just starting out there, I think around 2003, and just kind of hear about I know you've described it as some hard years in terms of building the program up. And I just want to hear from you, like, as you reflect back on that, what were kind of some of the things that stand out to you that really helped flip that culture?
Yeah, I would say so. Looking back on it, I inherited a very good program. So unlike the Pomona-Pitzer situation, when I came into APU, the coach that I took over for had been here 17 years, had won a lot of baseball games, Tony Barbone, well-known guy in the area. And here I am, a young guy. It's up a level because it's NAI from Division III non-scholarship to NAI scholarship in Southern California. There was a little bit of a cultural shift in terms of even across the board in Southern California NAI schools. At that time, maybe one or two coaches in our league were full-time. By the time 2 years into my job, everybody in the league were full-time coaches. Does that make right? And
Yeah.
then it's the arms race. Now you have a full-time assistant coach, and then it's 12 full scholarships at the NAIA, and half the teams in the league are getting the 12 now, right? So it's a combination of all these things you're battling. Does that make sense? I
Yes.
think one of the things that when I came in, they wanted a little bit of a culture shift in terms of how the culture of the baseball athletes at the time, how they integrated themselves onto campus, right? Christian university, Christian school. And so knowing that that was part of the process that the athletic director and the president kind of put on my shoulders to a certain point, we started literally recruiting character as much as anything, right? And I mentioned two guys that, ironically, they were two of our best character kids, and they turned out to be two of our best players in school history: Kirk Neuenhuis and Stephen Vogt. Both of them Christian high school kids, understood who we were as a Christian university, led on and off the field, right? And so when we started with that recruiting process, it was almost like, and not only that, we live in Southern California, so you can get 2-year instant good players like that out here. Mount Sac and Cerritos and, the Orange Coast Conference and all these 2-year colleges that just have phenomenal athletes. Being unfamiliar with that as a Division III coach, right, where you have to bring in high school kids and cultivate them, I started that process of recruiting high school kids. And so our first recruit class were all freshmen. Our second recruit class we didn't do the junior college transfer environment, right? Because I wasn't familiar with it. So one, that was purposeful because we wanted to create a team culture, but two, I wasn't super familiar with the 2-year environment out here. I was still coming off 5 years earlier. I was freezing my, backside off in Boston, Massachusetts, coaching 2 sports, right? And there's not a big junior college environment in the Northeast. So one, it was inexperienced with that. And two, is purposeful to create a culture. Younger kids, you can develop a little differently, right?
Yeah.
So in that process, I was able to get a feel. I talked a little bit, we probably talked about this. I looked at Biola University. John Verhoeven had been there for quite some time, the head coach. They'd been kind of the big dog in the league, so to speak, at that time. I watched how he recruited high school kids and then filled in with transfers, 2-year guys, important guys that can make a difference on a season, going from a 500 team to a winning team and that type of thing. And so we started, I'm a big observation guy. I like to read books. I like to look at what coaches do, right? And so I just observed how he did it. And I said, okay, well, if it's working for them, maybe this is the culture I need to create in terms of recruiting, identifying talent, and developing. And then once we turned the corner at the NAI level, then it was more a result of, okay, now we know what it takes to win at the national. When I say national level, I don't mean that as a national championship level, but in the a top 25 NAI environment.
Yeah.
We played LC State, Ed Chef, a legend in coaching, and so I remember from 2006, now I'm going to tell stories. In 2006, we were 500 and NAI team. Neuenhuis was a freshman, Vogt was a junior. And I remember taking a trip out to LC State. We drove, actually, it was a road. It was like, we got in SUVs and we drove all the way out to Idaho. People that don't know, that's like a 2-day trip to get beat 4 times by Ed Chef. And then Ed sent me the long way home. He said, this will be a better route. And it was like an extra 4 hours. So Coach Chef's out there listening somewhere. I remember that, Ed. And I remember walking off that field in 2006 saying, I'll never let this happen again, And part of it was they were the best in the country, the best coach, the toughest, the most disciplined team. Coach Jeff's one of the best around. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, all right, here's one model. Here's Biola. Here's LC State. They're winning a lot of games. How can I combine two with my personality and the recruiting to get to that level? And it was the following year that we had that big jump and made it to the World Series. And 2 years in a row, we're playing LC State to go to the World Series and be in the World Series. And I think that was a big cultural shift for me mentally to see what kind of athlete it took to win at that level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And please keep the stories coming. They're great. And I might be leading you into another story, but I've heard you talk in the past about having a player that sets the standard. And
Mm.
I don't know if this is something where, like, when you come into a new situation, like going into NAIA or stepping up to D2, or whether it's just every year having that player. And I know you've talked about Stephen Vogt being that guy. And I know you talked previously about a catcher at Pomona, but
Yeah.
just kind of talk about that, your philosophy of having a player that sets that standard.
It's I'm almost indebted to those players, and I tell them that all the time. So the player at Pomona is a young man. He's old now. He's probably 45, right? I was only 25 at the time. So Nick Beliach is a catcher for us. My first recruit ever as a head coach, and I was out at NorCal at Archbishop Mitty. I had watched 4 games in a row from 8. It was one of those big showcases up at NorCal. I'm at my last day of the games and I'm at the backstop just taking notes, and I see this catcher and he's dirty, and I'm watching him, and I know he's on game 3 or 4. It's just mass produced games, and I can't remember, they either were up or down by quite a bit, and he's blocking baseballs with nobody on base after catching multiple innings, right? And then I see him going out and talking to the pitcher, right? Staying in the game, being totally engaged in the process of what he thought in the moment the team needed: energy, leadership, toughness, whatever it was. And his dad, who was from Montenegro, actually, so he had a little bit of an accent, comes over and he goes, "You like that catcher?" I won't butcher the accent. And I'm like, "Actually, I do." And usually nowadays, I really try to hide from parents. A lot of parents, they try to get in your ear and they look, and it's a little bit of a grind to a certain point, and you need
Yes.
to be cordial and you need to be nice, but you just kind of want to do your job. And so we engage, and he goes, "Well, that's my son." And I said, "Oh, great. Why don't you give me his number? I'd like to give him a call." And so we get Nick to come, and he was the tone setter. You got to have a player that the players respect, that also isn't a what's the word I'm looking for? They're not uh, they're bought into the process. They're not bought into you necessarily. So what I mean by that is, I think Nick and Stephen both had the ability to sit back in the room when the guys were complaining about the coach being too hard, and engage in a process to allow that to happen, but also be able to put their foot down when the kids are just being a little bit soft on themselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you don't need the guy that's just a yes man. If you have a yes man, everybody can see through that. You needed a guy. I've always believed you've always needed a guy that has the team processes back, not the coach's back, the team processes back. Okay. That's always your greatest leader, because players see through that. If it's just a kid that is just a yes man to coach, I'm gonna blow that guy off 9 out of 10 times. But if the kid's living it, i.e., right, I'm buying into whatever our team process is because I want to win games. That's a great element to have as a coach. And I've had 2 guys like that, and I've had other guys. I have a guy on my team right now that, ironically, he asked when he came in as a freshman if he could have Vogt's number. He said, "Can I have number 13?" And that Vogt around here is like a legend, right? And so I like to break chops. So I was like, "Hey, that's a big number to live up to." And I said, "Not as a player, because as a player, you know, people can put up numbers, but at the character of who that guy was as a player, that's a big number." And he's like, and then the young man he's a captain. He's been a 2-year captain for us, Nick. Nick goes, yeah, I know. I want to be a leader just like he was. And he has been. He's been great. So, yeah, you got to have a guy like that.
Yeah, and I remember I was talking to somebody who played for Coach K at Duke, and I was asking just
Mm,
kind of about some of the players that were around. And obviously, we know the guys that are in the NBA, but I was asking about just the team in general. And he was talking about how everybody on that team, everybody they recruited, had leadership ability.
mm,
They were all leaders, and then not necessarily like they were all captains, but they just had leadership qualities in their own way. And I think almost like it makes recruiting easier
mm.
because you are a little more focused in your recruiting. And I know in college football, some of the most academically stringent universities have had the most success in their histories over the last like decade. And I think that's because they've had leaders that have come in and accepted, like, we're going to have to get high academic guys, and they've created processes around that. Do you think that that was maybe part of able to focus in on a certain type of player at Azusa? You mentioned you were looking for a certain type of background, maybe not going the junior college route as much. Did that have any effect on maybe like knowing what you were looking for in recruiting?
I would love to think like I don't I'm not as I think I'm pretty purposeful in my approach, but I don't know if I had to be super critical or just critical. I don't know if I'm as disciplined to say that it's A, B, and C that I'm looking for every time I go out and recruit an athlete or in a leader, because I do think there is that side of me that loves the challenge of a guy that may have never learned how to lead. I want them to walk out of here learning how to lead, right?
Hmm.
So as much as that leadership component plays into it, for me, I don't know if I'm as purposeful in the recruiting process as I could be. Now we've engaged as a staff and sat down and I said, okay, we put things in play where can we ask the right questions to the high school coaches and the travel ball coaches, right?
Hmm.
What do those questions look like? Because you one high school coach's perspective on a question is very different than another's, right?
Right.
So now you talked about Biggie. I'm sure I don't know if you saw, I'm sure you did because you're a sports guy. When I don't know if it was HBO, did Belichick and Saban, and they had a
Hmm.
little, and those two guys talk, right? And they
Yes.
talk quite a bit, and they're peers in a lot of way, and they're the best of the best. But I thought it was interesting. I kind of got critical on myself because Saban said, some of these organizations don't even call me to ask what I think of this player, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, whoa, I said, how do I like, so then I got critical of myself. I'm like, sometimes do I just assume I can teach guys how to lead and be tough? You know, do I have that much detail in my life? Like, Lord knows I would never put myself in the world of Belichick and Saban, but they're so detailed in what they do. They have a plan. We're going to make this call. We're going to ask these questions. We're going to trust these people. So yes, I think it's just, sometimes I just think we get lucky with some of the great leaders that we get. And then hopefully we have a process of development. But I would certainly like to get better at that. Let's put it that way.
Certainly. And I know that, obviously there's a give and take, right? You only have so many resources. Nick
Right.
Saban has
Yeah.
unlimited resources available to him.
Yeah.
And I'll share this with you so I'm writing a book right now about finding intangibles. And
Okay.
this is actually like a lot of the stuff that we talked about in our conversation was kind of like the beginning of this journey that I've been on. And I think I had told you about my master's that I had
Yep.
written. But I've been doing a lot of looking at kind of like the best in college in terms of recruiting. And I'm talking like David Shaw at Stanford and Nick
Hmm.
Saban. Nick Saban specifically about the evaluation process, and it's ongoing and it's never ending. And it's like you said, it's not only talking to the high school coach, which I think you have to do because there's
Hmm.
important information there, but you kind of know what the high school coach is going to say.
Yes.
Um, and I can remember when I had like first started recruiting that I had kind of started to talk to other people in the building. So the girls at the registrar's office that were getting you the transcripts, the academic counselors, and actually, like, it takes time, right? Like,
Right.
to go recruit Texas high schools for football, like, you got to hit a ton of schools, especially if you're at the D3, D2 level, like I was at this time.
Yep.
But, like, taking that time, you can talk to an academic counselor. They're not going to kill a kid, but they might say, "Oh yeah, he's challenging."
Yeah.
Versus me walking into a high school and saying, "Hey, I'm here to see Billy Cole," and every person I talk to says, "Oh my God, we love Billy Cole."
Right.
And so I think, like, there are certain things that you can find out throughout the process. Obviously, I'll share that information on Nick Saban with you, but you're right. Like, it does have to be kind of an ongoing evaluation. And I think I did the same thing in my coaching where I'm looking at guys like that and I'm like, ooh, wow, I did not go to that level
Right.
of detail.
Right. Right. For sure. Yeah, for sure. I was just thinking you mentioned that because you said saving with the evaluation process. Like I think the great ones know their detail, right? And so again, I wouldn't include myself on that list because I need more detail, right? So I'm looking at them and go, oh, I want to be like that. So I need this more of this in my life. But going back to Ed Chef, who's a legendary coach at LC State, with tons of national. One of the things I picked up from him was he said he would never let his coaches go to batting practice to watch a hitter that they were evaluating. They could only evaluate them off of live at bats. Okay. When I was younger, I didn't quite get that because I'm like, oh, I can see bat. I want to see BP. I want to see batting practice. I want to see him hitting the cages. I want to see his swing path or his bat speed or how the ball comes off. As I've gotten older, in fact, I just shared this with Kirk Neuenhuis when we were watching guys. We have some guys that can hit BP like nobody's business. You know, if you could win a game hitting batting practice, we'd be 50-0. Okay. Balls flying all over the place. And then you put them into a live situation and there's something not swing mechanic wise, but something going on in their brain, the quickness of how fast their eyes and their brains react. Right.
Right.
And so I do think if you're thinking about how they identify these coaches in each sport, there's probably specific things that some of the great ones really do for specific reasons, even in talent identification, that make a difference for them and why they continually have the best athletes on their field, right?
Right.
So I do think you're onto something with that for sure. I'm excited to read your book. Hopefully it's
Oh,
coming out soon.
yeah, and I'll be happy to share it with you for sure. I think you hit on something. You were talking about kind of the skills that you're looking for, and maybe kind of trying to put that athlete, or maybe put your evaluation of that athlete in the most realistic situation possible, so you're not just watching batting practice. And I've heard you talk before about your player development program at Azusa, and you guys have had a lot of success putting guys not only in the major leagues but getting guys drafted as well. And I just want to hear from you, kind of like, what do you look for specifically? And we don't have to get into kind of like the intangibles. I know we've talked about that, but like, just in terms of like the physical traits, I know there's always an element of development, but what are you looking for when you're looking at a potential prospect?
Well, from a we kind of look twofold, right? You have pitching, which is completely different than an offensive guy, and that's pretty much how we separate it. You know, our style of play from a pure baseball standpoint is more of a um, professional model. Like we're not going to bunt as we want to bunt as few times as possible. That's very different than the California model. I've read Augie Garrido's books. I've poured through them. Love all of them. Does that make sense? Like
Yeah.
so much makes sense how we play baseball out here in Southern California. The tree of Coach Garrido and all these coaches through the years. That, our yard, it's a smaller ballpark. I'm from the Northeast. My mentality, I want guys to hit. I want all 9 guys to be 3 hitters. You know what I mean? I want our shortstop to be a 3 hitter. I want our second baseman to hit 15 home runs a year. So it's just more of a mentality. That's part of the culture. And even whether our little shortstop, his mom calls him Altuve, and I'm like, great, we're going to get you to hit like Altuve. I mean, he hits a lot of home runs for a little guy. So even though we might want to recruit more physical guys, if that makes sense, because then, exit velocity, all those things that we see in baseball now, we actually just want to recruit guys that are good athletes and like to work hard and get in the weight room. And we feel like our development process will teach them, and our philosophy offensively, we're going to be aggressive as a hitting team. And so what I've noticed in some guys, they've come in and they've been a minimal power hitter in high school or junior college, if we have some junior college guys, which we do. And then they come into a program that just has a different switch on how we attack the game offensively. And they start to hit more doubles and more home runs than they've ever had, right? Now, if we wanted to do a study and analysis on it, they might strike out more than they used to too, right? That's the give and take of baseball. But at the end of the day, our philosophy is, hey, the more balls we're putting in the gaps or into the nets, we would say, over the fence, the more runs we're going to score, and we're going to swing at strikes and be aggressive. So I think the recruiting process, bat speed, is important. As I've gotten older, I've learned that sometimes it can't just be bat speed. It goes on what's going on in their head. So I've watched more, can guys react to the hung breaking ball, or do they freeze on it? Does that make sense? Like, that's when you have a guy that can already do that coming out of high school, he's an upper level guy for us. When he just can rip the fastball, it's a slower learning curve, I think, to get him to reach his full potential as a hitter.
Totally. I've seen this in football too. When I coached and recruited wide receivers, sometimes even as coaches, we're susceptible to seeing things on film and maybe more wanting to see things on film and falling in love with measurables and stats. And as much as I lean the other way on intangibles, like, we're all susceptible to that. And even looking back, seeing guys where it's like, oh, well, now I'm watching his high school film and he's always, 2 or 3 yards wide open. He's never catching contested catches. He's not really making anything difficult. Everything's very easy. And I think, like, in hindsight, I'm like, oh, I should have seen all of this, but you fall in love with all these other things. So
Yeah.
I totally identify with that.
Yeah. Good point.
Are there exceptions that you make in evaluation ever? Or are you pretty kind of, you've talked a lot about your process. Are you pretty process oriented and kind of stick to that process and evaluation?
No, we definitely make exceptions to that for sure. We've had multiple guys that don't fit our mold, right? They may be a little smaller in stature, right? If you come out and see our team in uniform, 6'1", 6'2", big, bang the weights, and then but I don't limit our access to any athlete. Does that make sense? And so hopefully we're creative enough, and as a coaching staff, we're adaptive enough that we can go, oh, you know what? That guy's a typical leadoff hitter. He's a great student. He has the intangibles. We think we have a pretty good hitting plan. We could probably teach him to drive the ball in the gaps, hopefully. Yeah, I want that guy. He's a good athlete. And I say this I'm a big New England Patriots. I alluded to that with Tom Brady leaving on St. Patty's Day last year. And Belichick, right? And sometimes it can get very frustrating because you watch him in the draft, and the draft's coming up for the Pats, and we're a mess right now. And I know no one cares because they've been so great, But I'm like, dude, why can we just get a superstar every once in a while? It's like he has a very specific process. And I think when I read stuff on Belichick and I see the TV shows on him and Bill versus and all that, in their draft process, I think, certainly I'm not going to analyze it like I know what goes on at Gillette Stadium, but I think a lot of times philosophically, you try to get the best athlete available, the best guy available. So I watch sports TV all the time, and they're like, New England needs a quarterback. And I'm like, hey, New England needs a quarterback. And we probably won't pick a quarterback in the first 2 slots, right?
Hmm.
because the quarterback that they wanted probably got picked, and there's a better guy on the board that's going to help their team win. So I think I've learned that through the years, reading a lot of stuff. To not learned it, but even in recruiting, I'm like, okay, I know we might need this right now, but this is the best athlete for us on the board. That could be a speed guy. That could be a catcher, a defensive catcher. That I'm like, there's just too much upside there. We got to try to go after this kid. So I think there's a little bit of give and take with it. We don't just sit there and say, okay, we're going to do this in our recruiting process and this. We're going to try to get the best available guys within our, you know, circle of recruiting of guys we've evaluated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I like that too. I mean, I think that sometimes you look at it, especially as you're constructing a team. I know, like in football, you're constructing like so many more players, and you have to think about backup situations and special teams. But I totally agree. Like, as I've evolved in my coaching, and I think I've changed on that, oh, well, you need this type of guy, but that's also kind of your role as a coach too. Like, get the best collection of players within your constraints, and then you can figure out the pieces later, or where the pieces fit later. It's a lot harder, if you put yourself in a situation where now you're drafting for need. And I think one of the problems in the NFL, if we could go off here for a second, is like, you have a lot of owners that will make hires, and now you've got a defensive coordinator, and that's a 4-3 defensive coordinator.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
like, you are building your entire side of the ball, basically looking for certain types of players within that system.
Mm-hmm.
And people are just like, oh, well, like the new hot name is Evan Burke, so let's go hire Evan Burke. Well, he runs a 3-4, and it's a linebacker blitzing, zone coverage type of scheme, which is completely different from what you just ran. You've spent the last 5 years building your team specifically for this. And I know they're pros and whatever, but like, that's part of the problem with a lot of these teams that consistently switch coaches, is there's no marrying from one system to the other, and they think it's just a plug and play type of situation. And you kind of hit on this earlier, where you have to, a lot of it is dependent on the situation, right? Like, certain
Mm-hmm.
guys that had success within your program may have not have had success in other programs because of the processes you guys had in place and because of the leadership. And I think that's kind of an under talked about piece, which is kind of like putting guys in the best situation to be successful, which is something that Coach Belichick has done routinely over the last 20 years in New England.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I could talk all day about the football stuff. So yeah, that's interesting. It's a good point. Well, and you see what offensive coordinators can do for quarterbacks by putting them in the right system. Like, look at Baker Mayfield, what he's doing now. They're a lot more play action. They establish in the run game. Like, I know it, but at the end of the day, he's a better football player because of the system he's in. Prior to that, I see him dropping back all the time, and I'm like, that's not who he is as an athlete. So being able to adapt what you're doing, I, I think is important too. You know what I mean? To be able to adapt to the style of play. So even for us, I'm not a big running team, but we have some guys that can run a little bit right now. So going back to adapting, I'm not super comfortable running into outs. Okay, as a baseball coach, when I feel like we can drive the ball in the gaps, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or I will run um, very intelligently. I'll run. Does that make sense? Where I'm like, odds are in my favor. I'm going to get this back. Well, I have Kirk Neuenhuis, who's 6 years in the big leagues. We have some more speed. We start talking about, well, if we can start to run better, if we can implement a running game because of the talent that we have, how much better is our offense going to be in terms of we're going to make our opponents start worrying about the run game and stop worrying about our hitters and start throwing us more. You see how it all plays in. Now, I didn't go into recruiting thinking I was going to have speed, but we show up in February now and we're like, oh, hey man, some of our guys, they can run a little bit, right? So let's adapt and use that to our advantage. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And very much like Coach Belichick. And the impressive thing is, like you said, we can talk offline about this, but like, Tom Brady is literally the only Hall of Famer that's been on that team, and they've
Yeah,
been the most successful football team in the history of football. And you look at all the other players like Peyton Manning, for one, he played with like six Hall of Famers on that offense. And that's
yeah,
great. Nothing taking away from Coach Manning, but it just kind of shows how the Patriots and that system has been able to evolve and really take advantage of guys that are kind of throwaways for other teams. It's really been impressive. And I know you and I could both kind of nerd out on this, maybe at a later date and time
sure.
on another podcast. But I kind of want to wrap up and just kind of talk about something that continues to happen in your career. And that's that you enter into a situation and you're able to kind of take that team from a good team to kind of like taking that next step to great. And I know this is something that you and I visited on previously. And I'm just curious if you look back kind of to the Pomona experience and kind of, you've had a couple of swings for Azusa, where you guys have kind of like been a really good team, but then taken that next step. And I think, the 3 years previous to last year were definitely an indication of that currently. And I just want to hear from you. Is there one or two things that you can point to in each of those situations that kind of allowed that progression? Or was it just more all encompassing and just a continual building process?
Yeah, I think it was probably more all encompassing, right? I think going from an NAI situation to Division Two, I think part of remember this is the whole package of stuff. Okay, so what I mean by that, it's recruiting, it's development, it's resources. Okay, it's experience, and so at the NAI level, the maximum number of scholarships you can have is 12. Okay, at the Division 2 level, the maximum number of scholarships you can have is 9. Okay, so Division 2, you have fewer scholarships. Well, when you're in NAI school and the school is only giving you 7 out of those 12, and then you become a Division 2 school, your 7 out of 9 goes a heck of a lot longer, right? It brings you up to the pack of elite schools in terms of finances. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So there's that piece I think that could make a difference for us transitioning from NAI to Division 2. Some of our great success that we had at the NAI, um, I had a nice meeting with our AD a little while ago. I was sharing with him, if you look at the timeline of APU baseball from 2001 until, in fact, I literally presented this to him a couple weeks ago, to 2014, or 12 was our last year NAI. There were 9 seasons we were fully funded. And that wasn't from the school standpoint, we just raised money. Out of those 9 seasons, I think our win percentage was 735, and we had been in 8 regionals, 2 World Series, and we were including actually Division 2 in that. So out of those 18 years at APU, 9 we were fully funded scholarship wise. 8 of those 9, we'd gone to the final day of a regional, 2 World Series appearances, right? And I said, so funding, I said, this is a collaborative effort, this is all of us, and funding does make a difference because it allows you to bring in more talent or to miss on some talent at times. We're not perfect. Some of us are sitting on contracts we'd like to get out of at times, right? So that we can at our level. So at the end of the day, I think it was a combination of that. We got brought closer to the pack. It made it easier for us to be fully funded to a certain point. Secondly, I think we talked about this a couple summers ago when we met. Trying to sell in the recruiting process an athlete and a family on Division 2 is like going to Starbucks in Boston and going to Starbucks in LA. It's the same experience, right? When you try to sell a family on an NAI program in California versus North Dakota, those are 2 different coffee shops. Does that make sense? There's such a drastic difference between the elite NAI schools and then the middle to the lower pack of NAI schools. Where Division 2, I think there's a little more parity. Of course, the elite like Florida Southern and Augustana and those guys, they've been like the class of Division 2. We're talking baseball now,
Right.
and we have UC San Diego out here, and I'd love to throw us in the mix with what we've done over the last few years. You know what I mean? In that area. But we get tagged into Starbucks right away when we're an NCAA team. So recruiting changes, right? My recruiting spiel, I'd have to spend at least 35 to 40 minutes of my 2-hour talk with the family on what it meant to be an NAI school. Now I just say we're a D2, and instantly that pops up in their head is all the D2s across the country that have been successful. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I think it's a convergence of all these good things, and then history has played into it. You know, when you have guys like Stephen Vogt being a 2-time big league all-star, and then we're in Southern California. I don't know if you're I think we talked about this. I'm a Malcolm Gladwell guy, right? And his
Yep.
book on right place, right time. Well, part of the reason why, you know, and the hockey players, right, and the kids that grow up in Canada and they have the right birth age, and that's why they're on the elite teams. We're in Southern California, so if we can recruit some talent, once we start getting that talent and something clicks, now all the scouts want to come to APU. They want to come watch our kids play. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If we were in somewhere else in the country where we're right next to Cal State Fullerton, one of the best programs in the country, UCLA, national champs, USC. So scouts can go to these elite programs and then say, oh, I'm going to run over and check a box over at APU. And then we got a guy like Josh Stallmont throwing 100 miles an hour. And they're like, whoa, maybe we ought to come over and watch more of these guys, right? So
yep.
I think of, you know, being blessed to be in the area we are, having an administration like, you know, our athletic director and institutionally understanding the process of this is a two-way, you know, in order for great programs to succeed, you need to have great administrators that are on board with it. You know, it's just not the coaches on an island. And we have some phenomenal administrators at APU. So I think all of those things played into our ability to hopefully transition to D2 and be okay.
Yeah. And I mean, this is something that I think I've seen in my own career, and I've been fortunate to be on a couple of teams that have kind of maybe in more dire situations than what you entered, like, but able to kind of turn things around. And it's obviously a lot of things coming together, but it's one small win at a time. It's being about the process, and you know, totally identify with that. This has been great, Paul. Thank you so much for taking the time. I do want to wrap up, and you know, one thing about baseball culture that we don't really have in football is the nickname culture that exists. And so I just want to know from your perspective, like, what goes into a good baseball nickname? Is it as simple as just putting like a Y at the end of the guy's last name, or just talk about that for a moment, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, well, yeah, there's a lot of Y's, like New and High, some call him Newy, right? My kids know him Bodie. They call him Voter in the bigs. You know what? Baseball is so slow. I think you have to pass the time with being having the ability to observe people, right? And then having some common, like, you know, being in the world a little bit. So you can there is a little bit of a skill set to be able to nickname somebody, right? And so we get a guy that we nicknamed the Water Dragon because when he runs to first, you ever see those little things on the TV and they run across the water? They call them like the Jesus lizards. And when he runs, it looks like he's got a tail on his whole butt, right? So, and I think it fits. Every time I say, hey, the Water Dragon had a good day today, I'll opposing coach that I know, because I won't call the kids by their real name. And he'll just start laughing. He's like, you know what? That's funny. That guy does run like a water dragon. You know? So just stuff like that. We like to have fun with it. So you just have to be observant.
Got it. And have some thick skin, I think, too, if you're going to be in the clubhouse. So
that's true. Yeah, we should have to be careful with that stuff. I will say this, though. I will say this, like that there is that balance nowadays, right? It's very different than it was a while ago. And one of the things we try to do is like we try to communicate with the athletes. You know what I mean? So with one particular guy, if he's been nicknamed the Water Dragon, you know, coaching culture can either extend that, or you can nip that in the bud right away. So hopefully being able to communicate, hey man, are you okay with this? Like we can nip this, because there's been some times where some other kids have been had some nicknames, and I'm like, that doesn't feel right. How are you doing? You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
then I can see how you respond, right? It's not just coaches nicknaming kids, right? And so we need to address that too, I think, as coaches, and be like, we're either not leading it in a negative way, but we're also communicating enough to let the players know you need to be comfortable enough and say, hey, this doesn't feel right, right?
Yeah.
It's a
And
hard
great.
dynamic. We grew up in a world where if you got a nickname, you were like, hey, everybody likes me, you know? That's not the case anymore.
Right. I totally agree. And we could probably spend, we'll put it to our next conversation about kind of having to adapt our coaching moving forward. But I think that's great coaching perspective to end on. And Paul, I know you have a game coming up, so I'm going to let you run. But thank you so much for taking the time, and best luck the rest of the season.
Thanks, Evan. I appreciate it, man. I
All right.
enjoyed it.
Same here, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care, buddy.